Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast. My name is Andy Robinson and today I'm joined by Dan Reed, my friend and colleague, as we continue our series looking at different passages in the Bible that have encouraged us as we live in the area of sexuality. So, hello Dan.
Hey Andy, good to see you.
Likewise. Now, obviously, at the start of a Living Out podcast, we have the compulsory 3-minute banter section, which I think the aim of this is to try and pretend that we're normal human beings, and then we give answers that will reveal that we're really quite odd. So let's see how we get on today. I was thinking a little bit about sort of past regrets. This is light-hearted, this isn't serious. So any light-hearted past regrets, sort of in fashion or hobbies or anything like that you want to admit to us, Dan?
There are so many. It's hard to choose just one, but one that came to mind was there was definitely a phase when I was younger where I had some kind of toy microphone, which I enjoyed singing into. I think it possibly even recorded. I hope it didn't. But obviously I had a phase of thinking I was going to grow up to be a pop star, but that's not happened.
So you had the ambition of sort of being a sort of pop star, and the fulfilment of that is speaking to a microphone for the purpose of the Living Out podcast. I mean, is this genuinely all your dreams coming true, Dan?
Well, I think that's one way of putting it, yeah.
I mean, the sad reality is that you've got fewer years of regret to look back on. I mean, I've just got sort of probably twice as many years to look back on, full of regrets. But I think I still have sort of old school pictures hanging around the place. And it was the era of sort of curtain sort of hairstyles with a sort of centre parting and a sort of curtain kind of either side, which, I mean, to be fair, as I look at the photos, I had one, but to be fair, everybody else in the photo had one as well. But I don't know what we were thinking. I mean, obviously these days, with my sort of expanding forehead, I look back on the time when I could have a hairstyle with a degree of fondness. But yeah, I need to burn those photos. Anyway, we'll move on now to more helpful things.
Great. So Andy, last time you were on here, you shared a bit about 2 Corinthians 12, which we all know you love. This time you've chosen Hebrews 2. So why that passage this time?
Well, for friends of mine who think 2 Corinthians is the only book I believe in, this was partly to reassure them that I do believe in the rest of the Bible as well. But over the years, as I've lived experiencing same-sex attraction, there's 2 main words that I've often used to describe the experience. So one of those is suffering. You know, there is an element of pain in living with same-sex attraction that I didn't choose, whether that's perhaps not having sexual relationships, perhaps some of the loneliness that sometimes comes with that. So I've always thought, well, there's a degree of suffering in this. And also there's temptation as part of the experience. At one level, to be same-sex attracted is to experience temptation to engage in thoughts or actions that aren't in line with Jesus' will for me. So I've always thought suffering and temptation, and then 2 or 3 years back just noticed the way these came together in one passage and the way in which Jesus speaks into that experience. So Hebrews 2:14-18 is my second favourite passage when I think about sexuality. So I think, are you going to read that for us, Dan?
Yeah, I'll read that now. So Hebrews 2:14-18. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. That's such a great passage, Andy. Do you want to talk us through it a bit?
Yeah, sorry, this is why I need to resist the temptation to become a preacher. But yeah, I mean, the basic theme of the section is Jesus' humanity. Actually, Hebrews 1 picks up Jesus' divine nature in many ways, and Hebrews 2 is all about what it means for Jesus to be human. And that's good news at so many levels. It means Jesus is a human being who's gone through death and come out the other side. Which means there is now hope for human beings. We don't have to be afraid of death anymore. There's a glorious future beyond the grave where Jesus has gone already for us. And yeah, I mean that just gives such perspective, actually. So whatever challenges we face in life here and now, they are relatively brief and relatively temporary, because Jesus' humanity and victory over death means there's hope beyond the grave. You get the sense of forgiveness that is secure because Jesus, our human representative, has paid for our sin, and so we don't need to carry guilt around because he's secured a sort of full forgiveness by dying on the cross. But I think particularly it's verse 18 that's always struck me most. Because Jesus suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. And so you just imagine something like Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, or maybe some of the challenges Jesus faces in Gethsemane, where there is genuine pain in that. It's not that it appeared to be difficult. It was genuinely difficult for Jesus as he faced the devil's accusations, as he thought about the agony of the cross and all that he was going to. As he faces that mixture of temptation and suffering. And that just means a lot to me. There are times when living with same-sex attraction can be painful, times when it's hard to say no to desires that might seem to offer satisfaction. And what's vital at that moment when I'm facing temptation is what image of Jesus I have in my mind, whether actually he's helpful, sympathetic at that point, or whether he's kind of looking over me in sort of accusation, slightly repulsed by what I'm thinking. And I'm just so thankful that the Jesus we have is a sympathetic one, both in the mixture of suffering and in temptation as well. And yeah, that's meant a lot to me over the years.
Yeah, that's so encouraging. It's made me think of a blog post I think you've written along those lines about those like kitchen floor moments in Gethsemane, and just knowing that Jesus has been there as well and knows what it's like to go through the temptation and suffering. Yeah, it's just really helpful.
Yeah, it's funny actually. I think of all the things I've ever written on the Living Out website, that's probably the blog I don't know, I most wanted to communicate. So actually it's based on Ed Shaw's The Plausibility Problem, which we've talked about far too much already on this podcast. But Ed talks about his kitchen floor moments, just those moments where he's finding it difficult because of his experience of same-sex attraction. And I'd always found that encouraging. But it dawned on me, again, a couple of years ago, that in many ways Jesus' Gethsemane moment is an equivalent of that. You know, where there's a sense aware of what it will mean to obey his Father, and yet willing to do that, obviously in a way that was more costly than any of us will ever experience. But actually also struck that is intended to be a pattern for us, that the Christian life will involve those Gethsemane moments for each of us in different areas. And we're not to resist that. We're not to think things have gone wrong if we face those Gethsemane moments, but to hold on to the fact that Jesus is sympathetic in the midst of them.
Absolutely. Is there anything else, any other kind of key takeaways from the passage, do you think?
Well, I think there's a broader question, actually. So I think one of the issues when it comes to sexuality is so much does come down to the image of Jesus that we have in our minds. So I think that works at 2 or 3 different levels. So if I'm honest, as I hear people begin to argue for same-sex marriage and so on, it seems to me that's based on frankly, a Jesus that is imagined to a certain extent. So we kind of take a slightly bigger version of ourselves and think, well, Jesus must think exactly what a 21st century person thinks about this subject. And so, of course, Jesus must be in favour of same-sex marriage. Whereas when Jesus is actually on earth in the Gospels, he does talk about marriage being between a man and a woman. But if I'm honest, it's also a slight pushback against those who would agree with what I've just said about marriage, but to be honest, adopt a kind of tone as they communicate it that means nobody who is wrestling with sexuality would ever want to come near them or have any sense of compassion in them. And again, of course, the real Jesus who walked around on the earth was somebody who was really clear about sexual ethics and yet lived in such a way and related to people in such a way that even those who fell short in sexual ethics came towards him and were interested in listening to him rather than running away. And so both in those areas, we need a right picture of Jesus, one who's clear on marriage being male-female and is also loving and kind such that people run towards him. And I think this area here is, again, just saying we need a right image of Jesus. So actually in the midst of temptation, if I have an unsympathetic Jesus, I'm likely to give in to temptation because I'm not going to run towards him. Whereas actually in the midst of suffering and temptation, if I've got a Jesus who is sympathetic, who at one level, not so much in the specifics, but in general, will be able to say, I know what it's like to go through painful temptation. I understand. That means I'm actually likely to go towards him and say, Lord, help. I don't want to give in to this. Won't you help me? And actually having those kind of conversations is a really useful place to be when it comes to facing challenges in life. And so that was a long-winded way of saying, in lots of ways, we need a picture of Jesus that is closer to the Bible. How's this work for you, Dan? I mean, do you empathise with having a distorted vision of Jesus at all, or I don't know, how's it work for you?
Yeah, I think I can relate to that. I think I've been quite challenged recently on, just having a view of Jesus that is based on how he's revealed to us in the Gospels rather than how we imagine him or what we would like to believe about him. And I think that's just really helpful to bring it back to the reality of his character and how he deals with people actually, and that being the same for how he deals with us. He's not kind of looking down on us in condemnation that you've been saying, but actually with compassion and as someone who's been there and is fully human and also fully God. I think that's a really helpful kind of challenge and encouragement to check our image of Jesus against the reality.
Yeah. I don't know about you. I think it's almost a sort of lifelong battle or sort of something you grow in throughout life, actually, is that almost constantly it's trying to conform our image of Jesus to what he is actually like. And in some ways, before we get to a new creation, we'll never manage that perfectly. In a sense, our vision of Jesus will always be skewed to a certain extent. But it's trying each time we read the New Testament, we read the Gospels, always asking the question, actually, do I need to change my image of Jesus based on what I'm reading here so that it's fuller, closer to reality, more glorious, more compassionate, more loving, more powerful? We've always got ways to grow in that. And it's just a glorious image of the Christian life, actually. We just grow in our appreciation of Jesus more and more as our picture of him conforms to reality. And as we're consumed by Jesus, and as we sense his sympathy, that should enable us to move on in the Christian life.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, I'm glad, might have more years of regrets to look back on, but more years of experience of growing in love of Jesus as well. So
well, still plenty of room for me to grow as well. Thanks, Dan.
I hope you're enjoying this podcast. As a charity, Living Out relies on the generosity of people like you to enable us to produce lots of free resources to help same-sex attracted Christians and to equip the church. So if you like what we do, please consider supporting us financially. You can give a one-off donation or set up monthly support by going to the website livingout.org/give. Thank you so much.
Okay, let's reverse things then. So we've just talked about Hebrews chapter 2. Dan, you've chosen a passage from 1 Corinthians 6. So do you want to explain why 1 Corinthians 6 means a lot to you?
Yeah, so this is a passage that we've kind of been meditating on quite a lot over the last year or so. I've kind of, spoken a bit before about my struggles with sexual sin and stuff, and a little while ago kind of got myself into a bit of a mess with that again, and kind of just thought something's got to change. I've got to address my behaviour, but also address kind of my view of God and how God views me, and try and let that sink in a bit. And I think this is one of those passages that God's given me to help me try and grasp a bit more of that. So I think in some ways it's quite a hard-hitting passage, and it's obviously written to a very specific context back in Paul's day, but I think it's really encouraging and still really relevant to us in our culture today. It's verses 12 to 20, if you want to read it for us.
Thanks so much, Dan. Let me read 1 Corinthians 6, verses 12 to 20. I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. You say, food for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. The body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord Jesus from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it said the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. So flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You're not your own, you were bought at a price. Therefore, honour God with your bodies. You're right, it is hard-hitting, Dan. Are there particular things that you've been helped by or that struck you?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that strikes me is just, again, that similarity between kind of our culture and the culture Paul's speaking into in Corinth. So I think from what I've read, you might know more, but I think it was quite a liberal culture. It's kind of, particularly in terms of their attitudes to sex and things. And so Paul's kind of addressing some of the attitudes that the Christians in Corinth have kind of absorbed from their culture, I guess, at the start. So they seem to have picked up possibly on their freedom in Christ, but also the kind of liberal culture around them that have got this idea they've got the right to do anything. And Paul was kind of gently challenging that and saying, not everything's beneficial though, and I won't be mastered by anything. I think bringing to mind that idea of you can't serve two masters, and if you're going to live wholeheartedly for Jesus, then he's got to be coming first in your life. And I think it's really interesting, that idea they have of food for the stomach and the stomach for food. It's almost this kind of idea that what we do with our bodies doesn't really matter, because ultimately we'll die, God will destroy everything. So just sort of eat and be merry kind of thing. And I think it's kind of a metaphor, I guess, for their attitude to sex as well and what they do with their bodies in that area. And I think is quite a similar attitude that we have in our Western culture today of just sex doesn't really matter. It's just a thing people need to do. So go out and do it. Have sex with whoever you want in whatever context. It doesn't really matter. But I think this passage just gives us so much more kind of dignity than that, and tells us that actually our bodies do matter to God. He's created us in these bodies. We've just seen in your passage that Jesus became fully human, and to do that he had to come in bodily form. In verse 14, Paul talks about how God raised Jesus from the dead and will raise us also, and that's obviously a physical resurrection. So our bodies actually matter, and so what we do with them matters as well. But I think kind of linked to that, what's really jumped out at me and kept me coming back to this passage is towards the end where Paul says, "You are not your own, you are bought at a price." And I think as I've let that kind of sink in, you kind of get the implication that that means we're worth something, and we're worth something to the God of the universe who made everything and made us. So I think in my kind of low moments, in my times I've struggled with kind of self-esteem and worth, and I guess how that's kind of driven me to sin sometimes. I think to open up the Bible and have God say that to you, that you were bought at a price, I just find that kind of incredible, really, and kind of I think it has started to change my life in a way. And yeah, just the reality that actually what we see in our culture today isn't anything new. It's not a surprise to God. It's not like we've only just realised that today kind of sleeping around or doing whatever we want with our bodies isn't actually good for us. I mean, it's there in the passage as well, kind of when Paul's talking about the body's not meant for sexual immorality but for the Lord, and the idea that when you sin sexually you're sinning against your own body. And I think that's just so true of real life. You kind of see the damage you do to yourself and to other people, and so it just underlines once again God knows what's good for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thanks, Dan. That's really helpful, and just really appreciate the openness about just sharing how this has begun to have an impact on you, because I mean, to be bought at a price is an amazing thing. It's really funny. I love this passage as well. I actually, just before the section you read or you chose, you get in 1 Corinthians 6, you get this list of sins, including actually those who have sex with men. And then it says, and that is what some of you were, which always excites me on this theme of same-sex attraction, just in terms of within the early church, there are clearly those who've become Christians out of some sort of gay lifestyle. And I think that gives us hope, actually, that the gospel can still be that powerful today. But actually, in the section you picked up, I just love this image of us being one with Jesus in spirit, which, funnily enough, that gets really challenging, because essentially Paul is saying you do realise you never sin on your own. If you like, you take Jesus with you to anything you do. And I don't know, I'm trying to think that probably is something that I should think about more, actually, whenever I'm tempted to engage in lustful thinking or whatever. Jesus is there. He's not disappeared, and because he's in me, he's still here. So one level that becomes really challenging, and another level though it becomes really encouraging, in as much as it means there's a power there to live differently. So I don't know, whenever I'm preaching on union with Christ, the way I'll sometimes express it is, every morning I ask the question, what are Jesus and me going to do together today? Because we're not going to do it apart. Whatever we do, we're going to do together. And so that can be challenging, but it's also encouraging. There's a power there to live differently, and that gives us hope, and as you say, gives us the power to use our bodies in different ways.
Yeah, I have to use that question. I think I remember a friend challenging me on that idea of when we sin, we're taking Jesus with us, and then you stop and think, oh, well, of course I wouldn't do whatever it is if I was thinking like that. And so yeah, it's really helpful.
And on the theme of bodies, I think, was it you who wrote the book review for Sam Albury's book, What Has God Got to Say About Our Bodies? So it seems like that whole area of the body is something you've been thinking about, partly with Sam's help and partly with the help of 1 Corinthians 6 for a while.
Yeah, it does seem to be a theme that keeps coming up. And yeah, that was a really good book. I'd recommend it. And I think he does actually kind of expand on this passage in that book as well. It's probably where this has all come from subconsciously. But a really helpful book.
And I love the way, I think you mentioned it, it's sort of picking up almost marriage language. So it's in the wedding service, isn't it? With my body, I honour you, comes up in the wedding service. And I guess as we think about our eternal marriage to Jesus, that line, with my body, I honour you, is just a really good outworking of 1 Corinthians 6, which I don't think I'd ever thought about before. But almost as we think about our ultimate bridegroom, using our bodies to honour him can be a really helpful way of thinking.
Yeah, and I think that's what takes it from being just a sort of old-fashioned or slightly stuffy passage. You might read it and think, what's all this about? The Lord is meant for the body. That all sounds a bit weird, and why are we sort of following all these rules and stuff? But actually, when you put it in that kind of relational context and you think about being united to Jesus and heading for that sort of marriage to him, I think that changes my perspective at least. And you can kind of picture it then in human terms. Like if I was engaged or married, then of course I would be thinking more about what I'm doing with my body. I'd be wanting to honour my partner with it. And actually that's the same for all of us, whether we're single or married. I think that's really helpful from this passage as well.
In a sense, we live as those who are engaged, don't we? In a sense, we are consciously thinking, I'm heading towards my wedding day, and so what I do with my body and wanting, in a sense, to keep my body for the Lord and to honour him with it is just the pattern of thinking here. So you're right, I know what you mean. Actually, it can read as, oh gosh, here are a load of commands that make me feel bad. But when we think, hang on, he's loved us enough to purchase us at great price, he's come to live within us, we're heading somewhere, all of those things act as motivations to please the Lord with our bodies.
Yeah, and it just gives everything purpose, doesn't it, I guess? It's not just sort of, I've been sort of handed this lot in life and it's going to be really hard and I've got to be single forever. And actually there is a sort of purpose and meaning to it and joy in it as well. And I think one other thing that comes to mind is just how this changes how we look at other people as well. It's kind of, I find it easy to make it about me and, I've been bought at a price and that's lovely. But actually that's true for everyone I see around me as well. So anyone I might be tempted to lust after or objectify, actually the same goes for them as well, and they've got incredible value in the sight of God, and so I should be treating them like that as well. So that's another kind of challenge, I guess, from the passage.
That's good stuff, Dan. Well, thank you. This has done me a load of good. I hope it's been useful to whoever's listening as well. But I think both of those passages are essentially motivating us to keep living for the Lord, even when that can feel difficult. So whether it's the fact that our bodies have been bought, whether it's the fact that we're united with Jesus, whether it's the fact that he is fully human and so sympathetic in the midst of our temptations, I guess we've put together 3 or 4 motivations to keep living for the Lord. Actually, whatever our experiences of sexuality, hopefully motivations to keep us living the Christian life. So, Dan, it's been good to be with you. I hope you've enjoyed this as you've been listening and found the couple of passages that we've looked at useful. Do just join us again in a couple of weeks' time when there'll be another podcast. But in the meantime, do check the show notes where there'll be details of the various articles that we've mentioned, and look forward to catching you again before too long. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.